Hi everyone, today's the second part of our two-part Haydn bio lecture. We're going to be talking about his musical style and contributions. Now we know that Haydn is the grandfather of the classical era, and so I think we can often fall into this small trap of thinking that everything he did was completely new. I don't think that's necessarily the correct way of characterizing him. Instead, I like to think of Haydn as being this major innovator, but he was still riding the wave of the musical zeitgeist. He took what was being done already and just made it significantly better. There's three major musical styles from the time which he was in line with, and those are Style Galant, Sturm und Drang, and Empfindsamer Stil. Now, Style Galant. It's French for elegant style, and it's a musical style that originated in the 1720s and featured periodic melodies, homophonic texture, and delicate ornamentation. This resulted in a light and airy texture, as exemplified in the works of Telemann and Scarlatti, and is contrasted with the dense polyphony of J.S. Bach. Now, these elements of style galant may be heard in the works of Haydn and Mozart. So think of your typical early to mid-classical sound, something like Eine Kleine. That's something we're going to be studying after Haydn, and you've really got style galant there. Sturm und Drang is German for storm and stress, and it's this literary movement of the 1770s which is characterized by heightened emotion and dramatic contrasts, and it's exemplified in the works of Goethe, Schiller, and their contemporaries. It foreshadowed the Romantic style and influenced Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. So Sturm und Drang didn't originate as a musical concept, but rather this literary one. And you'll see this more and more as we get deeper into musical history. Extra musical concepts come in to inform music. Remember that music isn't siloed. It doesn't exist simply in a vacuum. It was and still is influenced by everything else going on in the world, whether that's art or something else like historic events. Now, if you're trying to think of something in the Sturm und Drang style, I'd recommend thinking of Beethoven Pathétique. Now, Empfindsamer Stil is German for sensitive style, and this is an introspective, expressive style achieved through unexpected turns of phrase, abrupt rhythmic gestures, and chromatic harmony. This is exemplified in the music of C.P.E. Bach, and this style foreshadowed the Romanticism in many respects that we'd come into in future decades. For this, I'd suggest just really thinking of anything by C.P.E. Bach. Okay, so we've already talked about how Haydn is regarded as the father of the symphony and the string quartet, but there's a lot of nitty-gritty stuff about his musical style that we should note as well. Haydn really helped to develop sonata form, sort of filling out the framework of its constituent elements. You know, how melody develops, how harmony develops. But one thing we see less of as we get further away from Haydn is something that Haydn was actually like a pretty big proponent of, and that's the slow first movement opening. He'd tack on these slow intros to the exposition, to the beginning of the exposition, that had kind of unclear tonal centers, this sort of anxiousness to them because we just aren't really sure what's coming next. Like I said, as time goes on, this sort of opening to a first movement in sonata form dies away. But for Haydn, it's a big part of how he composes. And while he was a big part of developing sonata form, there's another big thing that he did which gave way to a different practice. Haydn's first movements were often pretty monothematic or single-themed. Now, that's not to say that Haydn didn't do the standard tonic key, moving to dominant or some other foreign key thing that's pretty necessary to sonata form and expositions within sonata form in particular. But he'd take the same or largely very similar theme and just transpose it to that foreign key. Haydn was also very influenced by folk songs and dances, and you can see this in sort of this playful nature of much of his music. And frankly, his melodies can often be pretty simple and straightforward, and that flows from this influence of folk music, I think. We also see him use the orchestra to create folky sounds, pedal point for bagpipes, that's something that we saw with Vivaldi, and pizzicato to emulate guitar. Haydn also likes to use these big dynamic contrasts. Just think of the opening to Surprise Symphony, where you have this massive crashing chord. He also injects dramatic elements into his work. He'll use sudden articulation changes or changes in keys or chords to emphasize something important. For example, in his Oratory of the Creation, Haydn uses this big C major chord to evoke the word light. So I want to use this opportunity to go through a few more definitions quickly to prep you for our Emperor Quartet study. We're going to look at a few terms, chamber music, string quartet, and theme and variations. I'm sure you all have a pretty good grasp of them. They're pretty self-explanatory, especially if you're a musician. But it can't hurt for us to give them a quick review. If you want to skip forward to where we go over some of the landmark pieces that Haydn wrote, feel free to skim forward. So chamber music. Music for a small ensemble, generally 2 to 10 players, where there's only one player per part, and the music is usually performed with a conductor. So think of piano trio, string quartet, string quintet, even string octet, that kind of thing. I'm sure you've all encountered this kind of music before. I'm really just trying to rattle these definitions out so I don't bore you way too much. String quartet. It's the most important chamber music genre of the classical era. This is the one that you want at your wedding. Its performing forces are first violin, second violin, viola, and cello. In other words, a good violinist, a bad violinist, a failed violinist, and a wannabe violinist. Structurally, a string quartet is usually in 4 movements: fast, slow, moderately fast, and ending with fast. And our first movement is typically in sonata form. We're going to be looking at the Emperor Quartet in our next lecture as an example of this genre. Theme and variations. You know, you'd think that theme and variations is self-explanatory, but we got a definition from the RCM on it, so I guess we got to do it. Theme and variations. It's a work featuring a statement of a melody, the theme, followed by a series of transformations, the variations. These changes can be made to melody, harmony, rhythm, or orchestration, and is often used in the slow movement of a sonata cycle. So that is a whole lot of words to say. Theme and variations means theme and variations. That wraps up our definitions. Whew! Now let's take a look at some of the important works by Haydn. Symphonies. We got over 100, including 45, Farewell, 94, Surprise, 100, Military, 101, Clock, and 104, London. Concertos, we got a whole bunch of them for piano, violin, cello, and trumpet. Now, 68 string quartets, including Quinten and Kaiser, 40 plus sonatas for piano, 14 operas, including this opera called Armida, 3 oratorios, The Creation, The Seasons, The 7 Last Words of Christ, and then sacred vocal music, where we have masses, including Lord Nelson Mass and Mass in the Time of War. And then finally, these things called novelties, which sort of include marionette theater works and compositions for this instrument called the baritone. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that bang on center, but it's an obsolete instrument anyways. So one little fun fact is that if you've ever looked at a Haydn score, you'll see these letters HOB followed by a number. And these HOB or Hob numbers are Hoboken numbers, Hoboken, and they act basically like opus numbers. They're named after this Dutch musicologist named Anthony van Hoboken, who cataloged Haydn's music according to various categories and gave each of those categories a Roman numeral. So, for example, piano sonatas are in category 16. Okay, that wraps up our Haydn bio lectures. Next time we're going to get into the Emperor Quartet. Thank you for listening to what I imagine was a very, very dry 8.5 minutes.